Welcome to Let's Connect Greater Portland, a show about the changes and the challenges we face and the great things that people are doing to make Greater Portland a fantastic place to live, work, and play. I'm Christina Egan, your host. Today, we're talking about the role that race plays in friendships, families, and even professional relationships. I'm here with Lyon, Shana Cook Mueller, and Krystal Williams, a multiracial group of friends that are willing to sit down and have an open conversation today, live on the air. Chris and Shana are white, and Krystal is black. If you have questions for our guests and want to join the conversation, feel free to call in at 207-780-4909. Again, that's 780-4909. Shana, it's so nice to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Chris, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And Krystal, my friend, I'm so glad to have you back.
Always glad to talk with you.
So let's start with you, Krystal. Can you talk a little bit about how you all know each other?
Sure. So Shana and I were colleagues at Bernstein Shore, so we had the opportunity to work together. And Chris and I met at a Conscious Business Collective event that really gathers B Corps and other like-minded individuals together. And I was talking about E for All, which is an inclusive business accelerator. And Chris and I connected after that event and have been in conversation ever since.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And what are your recollections of meeting one another?
Well, I'll just say Krystal and I think, got to know each other during the pandemic, and so met a lot on the screen and also got to know each other's cats. So
That is true. Taco.
I just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
The Zoom cat image, not the actual cat, right?
No, actual cats behind us walking.
Yes.
Around, so.
Okay, got it. And you, Chris?
And then a couple of connections here. So Shauna and I know each other from the B Corp movement. So I worked and had an early lunch with her and her husband when I moved to Maine, which was exciting. And just instantly recognized it. It wasn't just Fortunat, who was wonderful, it was also Shauna. So we're able to have one of those pandemic lunches where you meet and it's a little bit awkward. And then, I think besides the open warmth and the invite that I felt from Krystal, I actually remember the first time I sat down at Brundy Star with you as almost like the first time we actually met and just had a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I was like, this is a place on the map I need to know more about.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Now, it's often uncomfortable for folks of different races to talk about race, and it can be awkward, it can be difficult. But I know, just from before the show started, it's not at all for the three of you. Why did you want to have this discussion today on air about race and friendship?
Well, I'll start with this one just because this question makes me remember a situation in my life that illustrates how awkward it can be, particularly in the white community, to talk about race. And we might talk about this later, but my family is a multiracial adoptive family. And so when my two daughters, one of whom is black and one of whom is white, when we were looking for preschools, we went and toured a preschool, and the kids were playing and we were talking with the provider. And I asked about the racial makeup and diversity of the program and how they talk to kids about differences. And the woman answered me in a whisper. And I thought, oh, that's such an interesting illustration of how uncomfortable it is for a lot of white people to talk about race, at least not at full volume. And I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for this woman because it's really a product of how she was raised and how lots of us are raised as white people in particular to be hesitant about talking about race. And when I thought about what it would do for my kids, I was concerned that in having so much hesitancy in talking about race, my black daughter would think there's something wrong with her, and same with my white daughter, like that there's something wrong with talking about race with people who are different from us or you. So anyway, I think it's really important, and now I talk about race a lot, and it's not always comfortable for me even now, even though I do it for my work. So I don't know if others have.
Yeah. Do you want to go, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So I agree. It's never not uncomfortable. I think it's the question of degree. And so part of this is as I practice more, and intentionally that word practice more, showing up and trying to be more authentic about who I am, what I've learned along the way, the things I still struggle with. I find that this is actually the only way to lessen that degree, right? Which is to be in relationship, to make mistakes, to take accountability for those mistakes, and most importantly, to learn from those mistakes. I have an opportunity to just share my story. And I think for white people in particular, we each have an opportunity to move through the discomfort, and it's going to be unique to us. So sometimes just hearing somebody's real story is helpful. And of course, when you know the people that you're sitting at the table with, it makes it that much easier.
Absolutely. And I think that for me as a Black professional woman living in Maine, which is one of the whitest states in a post George Floyd era, it's almost impossible not to talk about race. And I love that we have a forum to lean into that discomfort because it is uncomfortable. It can be awkward. And I'm one of those people who says, let's take off our professional mask and just be real humans and lean into that and acknowledge that it's uncomfortable, acknowledge that it's a bit awkward. I have never said the word white in relation to people so much as I have in the past 2 years, and it is uncomfortable for me to do so. But it is so important for us to have these very authentic and honest conversations, not only for our personal development and growth, but also to help move society forward.
And I think many white people, as they're growing up, are kind of taught, don't talk about race, right? And that's maybe why you heard the woman at the daycare whispering. But since the murder of George Floyd, it seems that a lot of people are much more explicit about, okay, you are a Black woman. What is your experience? You're a white woman who's had some privilege. What's your experience? Things like that, that are make it easier for us to just put it on the table. Are you seeing any changes since the murder of George Floyd?
I would say yes and no. I mean, as a Black woman, I feel really fortunate in that I have a group of progressive friends, as the two lovely humans here with me today talking about this demonstrates. And so, from the perspective of my friend group, I will say that we are much more intentional about calling out or acknowledging our privilege when we make comments, and about racial dynamics that may be in play at any given moment. But I also grew up in North Carolina, and I still go back, to North Carolina to see family that's there. I still interact with a very wide group of identities, both within Maine and without. And there is not as much progress as I would like to see. And a lot of that comes from, I think, fear. People fear change. People fear change when they don't know what's on the other side of it and what the implications are for them. And also I think a lack of understanding. It also stems from a lack of understanding of our history. So.
And Krystal, you said that you were in North Carolina, and you hiked the Appalachian Trail. And after you did that hike, you decided to move to Maine. Is that right?
That is right.
And why did you choose Maine?
It's interesting. I chose Maine honestly because I just felt I'm going to get into the woo-woo of the universe. So
Go for it. We're there for you.
Energetically, I just felt a connection to Maine. I love the spirit of the kind of the scrappiness of Maine. I love the beauty of Maine. I love the coffee and the food of Maine. There was just so much that I appreciated about the state. And after my father died and I was, at this decision point in my life of going back to the Midwest where I was working and had the opportunity to go to law school, or could I come to Maine? There was just something in my heart that said, move to Maine. This is the right place for you. And what is interesting is that as a Black woman, I did not factor race into my decision. And very rarely in my adult life have I. I'm just very used to being in predominantly white environments.
Yeah. And when we think about Maine, it's got one of the least racially diverse populations. And I have a Black colleague of mine who's in California and was talking about Maine. And he said, well, there's a reason for that, right? Like how can we start to be more welcoming so that the population starts to racially diversify some more? And it's a big question. And I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think one of the challenges, and I lived in very progressive bubble, which I loved, Burlington, Vermont, before moving to Maine. And one of the challenges is that we thought we were doing great. We were welcoming. We had diversity in our city, and a little bit of like complacency sometimes around the actual experiences. And so, we had people that we'd connect with, and I've had people I'd connect with in Burlington that never talked about their experiences being Black, because there was almost this expectation of like, no, we accept you, everything's good. And, choosing to, lift the veil a little bit is challenging and hard and uncomfortable. So I think the more that we begin to show that we have diversity in Maine, we're not scared to talk about the wonderful things about that diversity and the challenging moments that we're facing, gives us the opportunity to show a little bit of authenticity that might tell people that we're a community of folks who are trying to be better, who are trying to build a better Maine and have fun together in doing so. And I think that would be attractive for anybody outside, just to say, it actually seems like they're doing some work over there. I want to be part of that, knowing that it's open.
Yeah, what you're saying, Chris, reminds me of one of the roles I play. I'm the chair of the diversity committee of the Maine State Bar Association, and some of the work that's been going on with that organization in the recent past has led to some feedback from folks who are outside of Maine but considering moving to Maine, who participate in some of the continuing legal education courses that are offered. And when they hear about some of the changes in the programming and some of the focus and introspection that's going on around racial equity, they have reported, actually this really makes me interested in potentially moving here. And so that's really good feedback for some of what you're saying there. And, certainly much more work to be done. But
you're listening right now to Let's Connect Greater Portland, a show about the issues we face in Greater Portland and the movers and shakers that are leading the way. I'm here with three of them today, talking about race and friendship with Krystal Williams, Shana Cook Mueller, and Chris Lyons. And I would love to, Chris Lyon. I added you added an S by mistake. I was reading an interesting study this morning in preparation for our conversation today. It's old data from 2014, but I learned that about 75% of white people only have white friends. And I imagine in a state like ours that is still got a ways to go in diversifying its racial and ethnic population, that might be even higher here, just speculating. I'm wondering why you think that's true. Why do you think that most white people are friends with mostly white people?
I think the simple answer from my perspective, at least, is that there's no need. There's no social, economic need for them to diversify their friend group. And so without that kind of outside forcing function, it really does require people to have a broader understanding and appreciation for the value of diversity in their lives. And most people, they're on a track in life and take the road of least resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps not malicious, but the impact is still quite significant. But it's just taking the road of least resistance.
And can I drill in a little bit? You said that white people don't have an economic or social need. Is that different, do you think, for people of different ethnicities?
Oh, 1,000%. Even higher than that. I don't, from my earliest recollection, growing up in North Carolina, there is no formulation of my worldview that did not include white people. And so for me, my earliest recollection is that my ability to interact and interact well with white people and the broader kind of system of power, who from my perspective outside of my church were all led by white people. Like I needed to know how to interact and interact well and to show up well in those environments.
And for you, Chris, and for you, Shauna, your friend group is more diverse than the typical white person. But do you have any ideas or theories about why white people don't have as many people that are Black or other ethnicities and races in their lives?
Sure. I mean, I think all of what Krystal said and the history. I mean, you mentioned this earlier, the history of our country and housing policy. And we live in a very segregated society, even though we are not under the law of segregation. And so that is an obstacle. And I've talked about it with some of my white friends who live in towns just a little bit outside of Portland, about how challenging they find it to be to make cross-racial relationships and friendships. There are certainly ways to do it, but it really takes some intentionality. I would encourage people to do it because for all sorts of reasons, but the richness of life is so much more expanded and expansive when we really are able to connect with people who are not like us.
What you're talking about in terms of this segregation, part of it is geographic, so that there's less opportunity for those natural collisions to happen between people of different races, particularly if you don't live in a more metropolitan area in Maine. And yet, it seems to me, if I take what Krystal was saying, that really there's a responsibility on the part of white people to try to create those collisions a bit more. Am I hearing you right?
Well, I absolutely believe that the work of racial equity will be moved forward to the extent we're able to recognize that we live in these racial silos for the most part, according to that research, and that we need to overcome that, build up our muscle about being able to talk about these issues with one another, and then just remembering we're all people and we all have cats, or we all like to do things that are in common that don't have to do with our race. So anyway, any other thoughts?
Yeah, and I think I'd just say I feel the responsibility, and I think it's about rehumanizing our experience. I truly believe that most human beings naturally are driven towards a more diverse experience because it's more joyful. Difference is fun. When you experience it, it's different than getting up and having the same routine every day. And, we also are deeply afraid of creating harm, and then apply the social context in which we're all raised. And no wonder we're a little bit hesitant, and we don't want to create harm, so we avoid. And I think the opportunity is to reach out and just be honest and real and say, hey, I'm trying not to create harm, but if I do in some way, I want to know about it, and to build a little bit of the kind of strength to receive that feedback. And then it becomes a virtuous cycle of sorts, which is you actually enjoy being called in and having people say, hey, when you said that, it kind of didn't sit right with me. And then you learn about the experience why. And so I think it's a human exchange, and it's a little bit of a rehumanizing effort that we all deserve.
What are a few tips for white people that would like to have a more diverse friend group?
I'm looking through the white people.
I can share. I mean, I think one thing that there's kind of like 3 P's that come up for me, which is I've tried to have like proximity, presence, and practice.
Oh, that's nice.
Put myself in the places where difference exists. Make sure that when I'm showing up, I'm actually there. I'm not thinking about what the interaction might be, what the interaction previously was. And ultimately being able to accept that this is practice and it's part of my lifelong journey. And if I show up with humility, I'm usually received well.
So we have a caller, Paul from South Portland, who would like to share a question. Paul, go ahead. You're on the air.
Hi, thank you. This could be a topic for another day, but I firmly believe that race does not exist, and that the continuation of the classifications of race provide an excuse for racists to continue to claim that there are differences. Again, it's a whole other topic, but I just want to add that the American Anthropological Association like 40 years ago, completely, officially dismissed the concept of race. Genetics is one of the 4 sub-studies of anthropology.
Yeah,
And
so
genetically it doesn't exist.
Right.
Of course, racism does, and we need to end racism, but part of that is going to have to be ending this idea that there's
that it's biological, right? Yeah. Paul, thank you so much for your comment. It's a really important point for people to understand that race is really a construction in society and our culture, and that it's important to know that we actually don't have very many biological differences. It's something that's kind of a newer piece of research that's come out. Do either of you have any of you have any comments on that?
Well, I agree. Race is a social construct, and it's one of those things where the train has already left the station, and so I don't know if at this point it is practical to talk about the complete deconstruction of this societal notion of race that has been embedded, particularly in U.S. society, almost since the beginning of the country. But I firmly agree with you that it is a social construct. It does not have any real scientific roots. And I think the question for me, or tying it to something that both Shana and Chris said, is how do we move beyond this construction of race to recognize the shared humanity that exists among all of us? Because at our core, we all want very similar things. Now, the obstacles that we face to achieve those things, the resources that we have at our disposal to achieve those things are different. And a lot of those differences can be traced back to this false construction of racial differences. And so how do we move beyond that?
Yeah, it's a great question and so well put. So eloquent, Krystal. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit more about family and race. And Shana, I want to turn to you to describe a little bit about your multiracial family and how you talk about race at the dinner table.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mentioned before, I have 2 daughters, one of whom is Black and adopted, and another who's white and born to my husband and I. And we talk about race all the time at home. They're tweens now, by the way. So there's lots of different evolving thoughts about all sorts of things. But we have really tried, as I think we had some obstacles to overcome as white parents of a Black child, to making sure that she was willing to talk to us about race, even though our lived experience was not going to be that of a Black person like hers will be and is. And so we wanted to normalize that in all sorts of ways, starting from a very young age, including the types of books that our kids were exposed to, the types of toys they played with, and just talking about it. And this caller's question reminds me of one of the very early questions my daughters had was, why do they call my daughter Black and my other daughter white? Because that's not actually the color of our skin, right?
Right.
And so to look at it through their lens, we had to acknowledge, just say, yeah, isn't that interesting? Really, your skin is the color brown, but in our society, there's a label that is put onto it. And it kind of sets you up for a later conversation, which now they're very well aware of, that that race is a social construction, and then you can begin to think about, like, why is that the case? Where did it come from? And we go back to history, and I really think the history of how this construction came to be is really important for us all to learn more about.
We're going to do another show just on Maine history, which would be great. And I want to turn to you, Chris, to talk a little bit about some of the work that you're doing with other white men. You're with a group called White Men for Racial Justice. Can you tell us a little bit about this group and why you think it's important for someone like you to be participating in it?
Yeah, and I think it ties really well to the question from the caller too, right? And just to start with, if we believe that racism is wrong and persistent today, and we want to be able to get to a post-racist America, we can't evolve until we reconcile all of the history, all of the outcomes, societal, economic, that exist today. And so with that recognition, for me, I learned about a group called WMRJ.
Almost sounds like a radio station.
Yeah. WMRJ, White Men for Racial Justice. And within that, it came in the rise of white people after the murder of George Floyd, saying, we're progressive minded. We know that this is wrong. We don't know what to do. That's really scary. Can we find a way to talk about this constructively? And so I joined that group soon after and started to learn. I'm a student of history and anthropology, and yet relearned our history through the different lens. And over time, what it's done is created space for me to be able to look at my own experience with race growing up in Florida. The messages I received, beginning to unpack that, beginning to challenge the question like the caller posed, which are, deep questions. And I would encourage everyone to think about that question. If this thing was made up, then why does it still matter? Yeah. You spend a whole lifetime, and I am spending a whole lifetime answering that and finding the facts and the experiences that help me better respond when that question comes up. So ultimately the goal of the group is to create a space where each man can find an opportunity to influence within their own worlds, their own network, so that they are getting off the porch, as our equity advisor would say, and not just sitting and navel gazing. So it's not a book club for sure. It's an emotional experience, and it's, deeply joyful in many ways too, to know how many white men out there care deeply and are willing to share their deepest struggles with messages that we grew up receiving.
Yeah. Can you say that question one more time for everyone who's listening? It was such a good question. Why does it still exist?
Yeah.
Can you say it one more time?
I may not be able to. I possess
Sorry, it was
this
so good.
miraculous ability to say something and then forget what I've said. It plagues me.
Yeah, I think you were asking, why if we know that this is a construct,
Sure,
and it's not true, then why is it still
Why does it
out
still
there?
matter? Yeah.
Why does
Why
it
does
still
it have
matter?
such
Yeah.
impact?
Yeah. And Krystal and Shana, before we wrap our show, which has gone by so fast, I wanted to turn ourselves to the professional realm. Both of you have been working with colleagues in different ways to help them understand how the workplace can become more welcoming for people of all backgrounds. And I wonder if you could just talk about why that's important in Maine.
Sure. So why that's important in Maine? I mean, I think it's important everywhere to have these conversations. And one of the roles I play is I lead programs for an organization called the Groundwater Institute that talks about the history of race and what its impact is today, why we still have to care about it. And I think that active learning and growth in environments that are multiracial is really an important aspect of moving us forward and really normalizing the conversations like the one we're having today. So, and I think, as Chris said, it's so joyful. It's so challenging and so rewarding at the same time to see how people are able to expand their understandings. So.
Yeah. And I would just agree with everything Shana just said. And more specifically, in the work that I do, I'm a lawyer and a consultant. And I just think back to Maine's history, which is something that people don't necessarily think of. But the first Black attorney licensed anywhere in the U.S. was licensed here in Maine. And I think that particularly for Maine, we have a real opportunity because of our demographics, because of the way that our state works and how connected it is in so many ways. We have a unique opportunity, I believe, to really be a leader in this field. And so it's really important to talk about and think about the workplace because we have a chance, I think, to lead the nation.
What a great note to end the show on. I want to thank you, Chris, Krystal, and Shana for being here today.
It was our pleasure. My pleasure for
Absolutely.
sure.